Super. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is James Croft. I'm the Director of the Centre for Education Economics and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for the launch of our latest report, the Wellbeing, Achievement-wellbeing Trade-off in Education. Now, I've got to start with reading the fire notice, which is a first. So, go to the Mothers Union, feel very looked after. I've done, I don't know how many events at how many different venues, and you know, it's nice that the mums are getting it right. Okay. So it says, on hearing the fire alarm, please leave the room in orderly fashion. Wouldn't be mine, for instance. Do not stop to collect belongings. Wouldn't be mine, instance either. Follow the signs to the nearest exit. The exits from the conference hall are as follows. To the right of the dais, the exit will take you to Great Peter Street. Wow. To the back of the conference hall, to the exit to the left, as you look at it, as I look at it, over there, will take you to Great Peter Street too. And the one to the right will take you past reception to Tufton Street. Well, basically we're fine, because there's lots of exits from there, which you might not think. We're in the basement. So, superb. We have Wi-Fi down here. I don't know whether any of you discovered the codes, but there's lots of M links if you want to find your Wi-Fi. And the password, quick if you've got a pen, is lowercase MSHSW, MSH, Mary Sumner House, Southwest 1P. SW1P, great. Oh, and then there's an exclamation mark at the end. So, those of you that can't spell off the network, we've got that. Okay, we're going to be recording for YouTube to go live on Thursday, following publication tomorrow. And I would ask, because this is a pre-publication event, that you don't steal our thunder if you're going to send a tweet. Talk about it being out tomorrow. Make a few general remarks. Thank you. Okay. So the Centre for Education Economics, for those of you that don't know us, is an independent think tank working to improve policy and practice in education globally through impartial economic research. We monitor global research output in the economics of education. We produce monthly and annual research digests to disseminate this literature. We publish in-depth policy reports, and we stage a variety of events like this one to engage stakeholders, including the public, wider public, in policy discussion. And as such, we're pleased today to welcome you to the pre-publication launch of our latest report, as I say, the Achievement-wellbeing Trade-off in Education. Now, to welcome our speakers, we're fortunate today to have both Jonathan Simons to my left and also Dr. Leslie Tufton with us today as responding panelists. Leslie is Programme Director and Senior Lecturer of the MSc in Behavioural Change at UCL. She's also Senior Research Associate for the Early Intervention Foundation and Associate Editor of the Journal of Adolescence, with research interests including developmental transitions in adolescence and young adulthood, the study of risk and resilience, mental health and well-being, aspirations and attainment, and school-based interventions. She's led research projects commissioned from government agencies such as the DFE, belonging to those of you from the department here and the Cabinet Office, including the 2012 paper for the Childhood Wellbeing Research Centre, the impact of pupil behaviour and wellbeing on education outcomes. Jonathan, formerly the Director of the Varkey Foundation of Policy, and prior to that policy exchange. He's on the move again, so we're watching this space to find out where he's going to end up. Yes, will be known to many of you with previous work at Circular Group, where he was Director of Strategy, and prior to that, Head of Open Public Services in the Cabinet Office, and Head of Education in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under Gordon Brown and David Cameron. Okay, well, thank you both for participating today. A welcome briefly also, and grateful acknowledgement to our sponsors, Cambridge Assessment, represented here today by Bennett Steinberg, Group Director of Public Affairs. Cambridge Assessment was established over 150 years ago. It owns and manages the university's 3 exam halls and carries out leading-edge academic and operational research in assessment in education. With a mission to promote excellence in education, the group plays a leading role in developing and delivering educational assessment in over 160 countries around the world. And as such, Cambridge Assessment has been an invaluable partner to us in staging our ambitious programs of policy-relevant research and events. Now, to turn to the subject of today's event, the idea that people, well-being and effective learning go hand in hand is an important tenet of progressive educational theory. As we know, according to the theory, real learning is expected to be energizing. So, education that does not deliver this experience tends to be seen as of poor quality, the result of some deficiency of the curriculum, an outdated teaching method, or even a lack of charisma on the teacher's part. Progressive theory has therefore come to highlight pupil engagement, stimulation, and enjoyment as preconditions for effective learning, and the relationship between them as mutually reinforcing. Yet little rigorous evidence has been presented in favour of this assumption. Indeed, the paper we released today presents evidence showing to the contrary, that effective learning is often not enjoyable and may indeed involve a trade-off with aspects of what we understand to be necessary for pupil well-being. So I'd like to, without stealing any more of his thunder, introduce the report author and my colleague, lead economist at the Centre for Education Economics, Gabriel Heller-Salgren, to the far left. He's also affiliated researcher at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Sweden, and a PhD student at the London School of Economics, and has published widely in the field of economics of education, and particularly on issues related to applied microeconomics. So, Gabriel.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, James. Let's see if we can get up. So, the concept of trade-off is obviously key for most economic analyses, and it's a cornerstone of economics, but it features much less in educational discussions. So when I'm in Sweden and I discuss education policy, I'm often told that by different people that schools must do a lot of things. They should improve their social-emotional well-being, they should improve their social capital, they should improve their character, they should improve their achievement, and so on and so forth. And when I highlight that there might be a trade-off between these different goals, I get a blank stare and they say, well, schools have to be able to do both. So in other words, if there's a will, there's a way. Now, I do think that it's crucial to discuss trade-offs also in education, and the paper I've written, the achievement-wellbeing trade-off in education, analyzes the trade-off between achievement and well-being, as the title suggests. Why well-being? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, it's of course the case that in the past decades or so, the emphasis on subjective well-being in public policy has increased radically, both generally but also in education. It's also the case that, as James highlighted, there is much modern educational theory that emphasizes kind of a virtuous relationship between the two, and as he also highlighted, this idea that happiness or joy for learning and academic achievement go hand in hand is an important tenet of progressive educational theory. The argument is that since deep, genuine learning is supposed to be exciting and joyful, education that does not live up to these ideals tend to be viewed as wasteful and ineffective. And this is obviously nothing new. This goes back decades, if not centuries, as I will come to later. This is just one example of the American educator William Kilpatrick in 1945, who lamented that what should be a really joyous and exciting experience learning within the structures of the traditional education system becomes laborious and repellent. The idea is then that the traditional education system is basically insufficient because it's characterized by regimentation, memorization, and drill. The solution is also kind of well known. The argument is that we need to move towards pupil-centered methods. And that one of the reasons that pupil-centered methods, such as if pupils are allowed to explore their own knowledge and construct their own knowledge, they will enjoy their experience more, they will engage in this deep learning, and they will eventually learn more. So progressive theory has come to highlight, at least part of it, has come to highlight the relationship between pupil-led learning, enjoyment, and performance as a virtuous circle. And this idea has also come to influence public policy, both national and international. This is Public Health England in 2014 argued precisely that if we promote the well-being of kids, that has the potential to improve educational achievement as well, and other outcomes as well. This is the OECD's educational guru Andreas Schleicher, who in 2010 argued basically this long quote. I'm not going to go there. Basically, it's like people have argued that schools must be boring and dominated by rote learning before deeper, more invigorating learning can flourish. And he argues that if we continue to hold on to this view, we shouldn't be surprised that pupils may lose interest or even drop out of school. So in this sense, it's like if we don't make learning more fun and joyous, deep, or whatever, then there will be no learning at all. And this also has influenced the policy prescription. This is from a report in 2017 on well-being, pupil well-being, where they argue that education systems should make learning more enjoyable and fulfilling for its students, so that high performance and personal happiness become self-reinforcing goals. So there's no doubt that this idea of a virtuous circle has influenced policymakers, at least their ideas about how education should be carried out. Which is obviously, it would be good because it's a convenient story as well. You don't have to choose between different goals. Where does this idea come from? As I highlighted, it's old. As many others, I argue that the kernel of progressive thinking can be traced to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile, or an Education, which was published in 1763. This publication was obviously hugely influential, not only for educationalists, but in general for how we view childhood as a kind of a distinct sphere that's separate from adulthood, where kids were supposed to be, a childhood as a kind of a period of innocence and engagement and so on. And Rousseau has been highlighted to argue in favor of more progressive education. He implores us that regular lessons basically to stop the traditional education system, simply because the system produces a barbarous education which sacrifices the present for an uncertain future and loads the child with every description of fetters, and begins by making him wretched to prepare him for some faraway indefinite happiness he may never enjoy. So the argument is, Rousseau was a naturalist. He believed that kids, the natural state is, you shouldn't impose anything on the child. So any external incentives, any punishments or rewards, as long if they were not natural, were bad. So obviously it follows then that this should be something to be emphasized. The argument is basically that traditional education in this way destroys children's natural desires and interests. The solution is also well known. We shouldn't give the pupil any lessons verbally. The pupil ought to receive none except from experience. Again, exploring by themselves and constructing knowledge by themselves. So in this interpretation, it's basically Rousseau viewed traditional education not only insufficient from a learning perspective, but something that essentially contradicted human nature. And the solution then allow pupils to learn more by themselves is then to move back the pupil or the kid to towards the state of nature. Basically, the argument becomes that the search for knowledge is associated with happiness, and happiness is associated with the search for knowledge. So in this view, both critics and supporters have tended to read Rousseau as advocating the best education ought to entail a happy childhood obtained through freedom. There's little doubt that he had an impact on how educational theory then developed. Some people have argued that educational theorists like John Dewey, they never read him. We can discuss exactly how much influence he had, but we can't escape the importance of Rousseau for understanding progressive educational theory, and especially its emphasis on happiness and child-centered learning. However, I also argue that there's been a little bit of misinterpretation of Rousseau. It's not just me. There's an educational researcher called Avi Mintz from Israel who's written a very interesting paper on this. There's little doubt, of course, that Rousseau emphasized happiness in his writings. But it's absolutely crucial to understand that he did not equate happiness with positive feelings. Indeed, there's another key theme in Emile, which is often ignored entirely, and that's the importance of suffering. In fact, according to Rousseau, that's the most important lesson Emile has to learn, to suffer. This doesn't really chime well with the other emphasis on happiness as we've come to see it. But it is possible to reconcile them, and that's because for Rousseau, happiness, as I said, is not joy or pleasure. Was common to equate those two things during the Enlightenment, but instead he subscribed to this idea of human flourishing, this classical idea of eudaimonia. To be happy is to live well. In order to live well, one must maintain one's desires and abilities in equilibrium, and in order to do so, one must be virtuous, so one must earn the right to be happy. Essentially, Emile must learn to accept and endure the suffering that is inevitably part of the human condition. And learning to accept and endure suffering turns out to depend on experiencing it a great deal. So in this sense, just because pupils suffer or are not happy doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong. And for Rousseau, also suffering was emphasized as a pedagogical tool. Because it's a byproduct of confronting one's own inadequacies, and it then becomes a powerful source of motivation to overcome these inadequacies. In this sense, it becomes a wellspring of learning. The theory is simple. It's not fun to reach obstacles that you can't get over, but it might be crucial for learning itself. So the argument is that it seems that the progressivists here turn Rousseau's ideas about children's interests upside down. They really valued these deep learning, motivation, and they thought that these were joyous experiences, whereas for Rousseau, actually, those experiences could be characterized by great emotional anguish, in fact. And there is some truth to this idea, or it seems to be the case that he was onto something when it came to this idea that suffering could play a pedagogical tool. Of course, there is a positive correlation at the individual level between personal happiness and achievement, so happy kids perform better. That doesn't mean that that is causal. It could be a third variable that makes the kid both happy and high achieving. There can be a lot of reverse causality. So the question is, do reforms and interventions that increase academic achievement, do they have a positive impact on well-being and vice versa? At a general level, we know from psychological research where they've given kids a pager, when they're asked to rank their happiness at certain moments during the day. And it turns out that according to this research, it's clear that pupils' happiness is the lowest when they're in the classroom and when they're doing school and homework. It declines when they're in school, and it increases when they're not in school. At the same time, more time in school, instruction, and homework do raise achievement, according to various studies. So at the very general level, there appears to be a trade-off between school well-being and achievement. And we shouldn't be surprised then that if we look at reforms, as I said, that study various interventions, or sorry, studies that study various reforms or interventions find similar or support this general argument. Indeed, one example is external school leaving exams. So not all countries have these, and Germany didn't have them until the PISA shock of 2000, when they realized they were not as good as they thought. They started to, so in Germany, there are separate states, and those separate states basically control education. So after that PISA shock, there were more and more states deciding that we're going to introduce these school leaving exams, externally marked. And this reform, or these reforms, have been studied, and they tend to raise achievement as well as labour market outcomes in the long term, but they appear also to have strong negative effects on attitudes toward learning. So kids become better at mathematics, but they hate it more. I mean, they don't like it at all. There's also a reasonable mechanism to explain this trade-off. These researchers have found that when they introduced these school leaving exams, kids tended to report stronger learning pressure on themselves, as well as increasing the amount of homework that teachers gave to the pupils. So they also tend to spend more time in the classroom discussing this homework. So it shows pretty well that kids do not like doing homework. These kind of reforms increase the homework and also increase learning pressure, and kids learn more, but they became unhappy. I have done some research myself, which was published earlier this year in the Economics of Education Review, where I looked at the impact of independent school competition. And what I find is that independent school competition appears to improve PISA achievement across countries, at the same time as it lowers pupil happiness and other related outcomes, such as peer relations and teacher relationships. Again, I look at some mechanisms, and what I find is that competition increases parental achievement pressure, not this time not on the kids, but on the head teacher. So they report that they are under much more pressure to achieve higher grades for the kids. It increases the amount of homework as well as instructional hours, at the same time as decreasing pupil-led teaching, such as project work, and making teaching more hierarchical, as well as worsening pupil-teacher relationships. Okay? So we have a situation again where the reform, in this case independent school competition or voucher reforms and so on, would raise achievement, but it would decrease well-being or happiness. At the end of the day, we're also interested about teaching practices, because this is, after all, what the progressives have argued should lead to more happiness. And there's plenty of research looking at the impact of teaching practices, and they tend to improve achievement. They tend to decrease achievement, progressive with these kind of project work and group work and so on. So they tend to decrease pupil well-being and decrease achievement and increase pupil well-being and attitudes towards learning. And traditional teaching then, the effect is the opposite. This can also be demonstrated using data from PISA 2012, which was the first time pupils were asked how happy they were at school. And what I did was that I analyzed the relationship then between the average score in the country, holding constant for some various pupil background variables as well as educational expenditures. And this is basically what it looks like. The first graph here shows the positive relationship that the index of the pupil-led teaching methods was basically a combination of different types of pupil-led teaching methods in PISA 2012, and the average happiness is quite strongly positive. At the same time, if you look at the next graph, this is exactly the same model, but I swapped the pupil well-being or pupil happiness as the dependent variable for average achievement in PISA. So you can see that it's quite negative. And the same countries are in this case. Sweden and Mexico have a lot of pupil-led teaching methods and a lot of happy kids, but they don't perform that well in that. Then, of course, the question comes, I mean, it's quite interesting to look at the evidence and then go back to the OECD's admonishments that I mentioned, that we should focus more on pupil well-being. Because they do that, and that's quite astonishing that they don't want to look more specifically at the evidence. But in fact, they ignore their own evidence, because in the same study, the reason why they mention is that we should explore ways to do this is because they find a negative relationship between happiness and performance at the country level. And this is exactly the same types of relationship that they draw policy conclusions from in the regular reports in PISA. But in this case, they say, oh no, we should ignore this, let's just go back, and this is not causal at all, and we must revert to this idea that achievement and happiness go hand in hand. So in any case, the question then is, I mean, this doesn't mean, what I've just shown you is that there's a trade-off. It doesn't mean that we should ignore people well-being. Should, educators care more about well-being or academic achievement? Well, that depends on the relative kind of societal and personal benefit in the long term, in terms of things such as income and other things. And that's the main question. And I do a very basic cost-benefit analysis where I use other research to calculate how much we would expect income to increase when the kids are 35 if we improve their academic achievement by so and so much, and how much their well-being, how much that would be affected by well-being. And what it suggests is that youth following achievement is a much better predictor than well-being and adult income. So if you care about adult income, it's better to focus on achievement. On the other hand, youth well-being is a considerably more important predictor of cognitive achievement for adult life satisfaction. So if we care mostly about subjective well-being, the argument here is that we should focus more on well-being in school than academic achievement. Now, this is very tentative, and I wouldn't draw too strong policy conclusions from this. We need much more research, looking at the long-term effects, for example, of these reforms and interventions that affect achievement and well-being differently. But overall, it's just a kind of teaser in terms of the attractiveness of different strategies are likely to depend on which goals policymakers seek to advance. So just a brief conclusion of the paper, what I find is that progressive educationalists argue that schooling must be made more enjoyable to be more effective. And this is also a view that is popular in the higher echelons of international policymaking. The fundamental assumption here is that pupil happiness and successful learning go hand in hand. It stems from a particular reading of Rousseau, which I argue led educationists partly to ignore the importance of the word suffering is probably not a great, obstacles or something, as a pedagogical tool. And the evidence then supports this idea that there is a trade-off between achievement and pupil well-being. Importantly, this is not likely to be the only trade-off in education. And there are other things as well. So there's some evidence, for example, these progressive methods actually improve pupil social capital. It's beyond this paper, and I can't answer the question exactly which goals we should focus on. But the main lesson from the paper is simply that the concept of trade-offs should be taken seriously in education. We have to consider whether there are trade-offs between all these different goals that we claim that schools should be able to reach. Thank you.
Shut that now.
Oh, really?
Would you like to speak from?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Many thanks for inviting me today to be a panelist on this important topic. I'd like to start by summing up what I think are the main hypotheses or assumptions of this report. First, student well-being is happiness. Second, pupil teaching leads to higher well-being but lower achievement. Third, pupil suffering is a key pedagogical tool. And fourth, there's a trade-off between achievement and well-being. Given the limited time, I'm going to focus on four main questions which are relevant to these hypotheses. First, what is student well-being? In this report, student well-being is equated with happiness. Happiness was measured with a single item, asking whether students are happy at school. Happiness is one way to measure what we call subjective well-being, and that's how happy or satisfied you feel in a certain context or environment, or more generally in life. But this is a very narrow conception of well-being. In fact, the OECD measures students' well-being according to four different dimensions: cognitive, physical, psychological, and social, each with many multiple indicators and measures. And this is just one item of those. With this in mind, it's important to consider that what we're talking about today in this report is moment-to-moment happiness and not student well-being. Second, what are effective teaching strategies? In this report, pupil-led teaching methods are examined using the PISA data, which seem to be measured with the following 4 questions. The teacher gives different work to classmates who have difficulties learning and/or to those who can advance faster. The teacher assigns projects that require at least 1 week to complete. The teacher has us work in small groups to come up with a joint solution to a problem or task. And the teacher asks us to help plan classroom activities or topics. It is not clear to me whether these items constitute a valid and reliable measure of pupil-led teaching. Also, is the low end of this scale considered traditional teaching methods? We can't assume this because what we might consider as more traditional teaching, asking questions about memorization and drill, are not asked and then reversed to make this measure. Taking this measure aside, let's get back to my question. What are effective teaching strategies? As you know, the Educational Endowment Foundation has created a teaching and learning toolkit with the strength of evidence, cost, and impact in terms of additional months of learning. If you look at the toolkit, some of the strategies which are considered or might be considered pupil-led have been shown to be effective, like collaborative learning, showing 5 months of additional progress, and individualized instructions showing 3 months additional progress. On the other hand, more traditional teaching methods also show moderate impact, like phonics for younger children and homework for secondary school students. So my point here is that effective teaching is not necessarily about using pupil-led or teacher-led methods. Rather, effective teachers use a range of different strategies that are well chosen based on the subject, task, and the classroom context, as well as the developmental needs of the students themselves in terms of their understanding and their knowledge and their progression. My third question is, what is the relationship between happiness and achievement? The paper shows that there's an inverse relationship between pupil-led teaching and the PISA test score, and a positive relationship between pupil-led teaching and students' happiness. Although both figures show there's a lot of variation around those OECD countries. Nevertheless, just because A is negatively associated with B and A is positively associated with C, we cannot assume that A and C are related in an inverse direction. And if they are, just like Gabriel said, it might be due to a confounder. In other words, children's unhappiness does not predict higher achievement. In fact, a recent systematic review of 300 studies finds just the opposite, that there is a positive relationship between psychological and emotional well-being and academic achievement. We also need to remember that the outcome here that we're talking about is the PISA test score. Previous achievement is not considered. It doesn't seem to be controlled for. So unlike the EEF toolkit, we are not talking about progression. And what about those countries that are outliers? Let's look at Great Britain, for example. Great Britain has higher than average PISA exam scores, average use of pupil-led teaching, but the lowest average level of student happiness of all the countries listed on the figure. Or Japan, with one of the highest levels of student happiness, with the highest PISA test scores, and slightly lower than average use of pupil-led teaching. An earlier paper cited in the report found that competition from autonomous schools has relatively large positive effects on PISA achievement, and at the same time leads to lower pupil happiness. In this paper, instrumental variables were used as a method of estimation. However, there's a lot of limitations with this approach. because as we know, that there are weak instruments, weak measures were used. We don't know their validity and reliability. And there's lots of potential confounders. For example, any of these baseline characteristics, such as baseline well-being or even baseline achievement. And this leads to very biased and imprecise results. So my point here is there's no robust evidence in this report that being happy at school is a necessary condition to achieve. And therefore, there's no reason to assume that we need to trade off between students' well-being and their achievement. Given this, maybe, just maybe, we can have both. Effective teaching that leads to student learning and achievement in a school environment that's positive, yet challenging, where students learn to be resilient, which is similar to the notion of flourishing, and continue to persevere even when they get things wrong and be engaged in their learning. In fact, you can look toward some evidence-based interventions to show that this does exist. Just look at the Early Interventions Foundation's guidebook, and you will see interventions that have been shown to improve well-being as well as achievement-related outcomes. So this leads to my final question. What do we value as student outcomes? Perhaps a better question is what outcomes matter in our changing world when we consider the accelerating rate of globalization and technological advances. According to the OECD, children today will be in jobs that have not yet been created, using technologies that have not yet been invented, and tackling problems that have not yet been anticipated. In this digital age, the need for children to learn and memorize facts is fading fast. It is being replaced by the need to learn how to filter and assess information critically. Children today will need a greater ability to learn how to learn, to think about their own thinking, to possess problem-solving and critical thinking skills, and to be resilient in the face of fast-moving change. There's also an increasing emphasis on character skills such as creative thinking, curiosity, self-regulation, and grit. Collaboration is important as well as sustained shared thinking when two or more individuals work together in an intellectual way to solve a problem, clarify a concept, or evaluate an activity. This mirrors the way many of us work in an effective workplace. We also know that mental health is a significant issue which costs our society on many different levels. People with poor mental health have worse educational and occupational outcomes, are more likely to engage in dangerous health behaviors, and are more likely to be poor parents. As this report notes, being happy or unhappy at school is linked to the student's mental health. So my question to you is, what do we value as student outcomes? I envision what is possible: a supportive and positive school environment where students develop the abilities that they have and learn skills and knowledge necessary to flourish in the 21st century. And there's no evidence to suggest that these goals are mutually exclusive. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, James, and also to the other panelists, Gabriel and Leslie. So I'm not an academic, as you can see from my bio, I'm not anything at the moment. What I thought I would do is give a few reflections from, I guess, a policy perspective, largely from the UK, but also internationally as well. The reason I really like this report is it says two things right up front, which in 15 years of working in public policy and education, I think I've hardly ever heard articulated. The first thing it says is there are trade-offs in public policy making. And hardly anyone publicly ever says that, and it is absolutely true. And the second thing Gabriel says, which I also completely agree with, is choosing which option you take depends on what your goal is. And again, we never talk, and by we I mean predominantly here politicians, we never talk about what our goals are in education. And I just want to unpack both of those for a second. Because the general point that there are trade-offs is of course true. Because at the margins, deploying your resources, whether those are financial resources, human resources, time resources, political resources, are finite, When your demands are infinite, you have to make choices. That's just simply a matter of fact. But those are difficult to contemplate. They are hard to articulate. If you're a politician, it's not a particularly attractive thing to argue, because essentially what you're saying is you can't solve everything. So what do politicians do? They tend to duck those decisions. You hear lots of grand talk about false dichotomies in education. You hear lots of discussions about how, of course, it's entirely possible to achieve A and B and C and D and even hell, E and F and G at the same time. And the honest truth is that that is not true. It is almost never possible to achieve A and B and C and D, because, as I've said before, your resources are finite. And the further we get down the road of educational development, and the more that is currently being done as activity, you get to the point where you are on the kind of frontier. You have to stop doing A in order to do some more of B, because unless you can become more efficient, which is of course possible, at some point you have to make those trade-offs. Secondly then, it depends on what your goals. And let's think in the UK context of what are the types of goals that Secretaries of State for Education say. So they say things like, we want to improve attainment and narrow the attainment gaps. So sort of that was a new Labour one. We have a lot of discussion about social mobility. And there was one, I think it was Gordon Brown, who made Britain the best country in the world for young children to grow up in. Now, all of those are fine, albeit a bit motherhood and apple pie. But actually, they don't really get to the point which both David and Leslie talked about, which is, are we attempting to improve adult income? Are we attempting to improve well-being? It may or may not be possible to do both. But actually, at that level, that's almost never articulated. And I think any politician would find it almost impossible, if really pressed, what are you attempting to do in the Department for Education? We're attempting to improve children's outcomes. Fine. For what purpose? To what end? Well, so they can be more successful adults, yes, but what does successful mean? And actually trying to pin that down, and actually trying to have that discussion, almost never happens. It does happen occasionally within Departments of Education amongst officials, but in some senses that's no good, because ultimately all that does is it goes up in a memo to the Secretary of State, and he or she will choose which option they want to proceed. But almost no discourse, and I apply this now more broadly to international education, ever really starts to pick at what is the main purpose we are trying to achieve. And so my contention is, if there is a trade-off at some point, and if we are, as policymakers internationally, not comfortable in discussing what is our ultimate goal, we are going to come from. A couple of other points that are worth making, and I'm very adroitly going to sidestep the kind of very polite academic discourse about whether there is this trade-off in this particular instance or not. But it is worth noting that if you look at public responses on things like public policy issues that people care about, what has happened in the past 40 years or so across most of the Western world, the OECD-rich nations, is that the proportion of people expressing that their primary concern in public policy in what are called post-material concerns has considerably increased. By which I mean people who express concerns about issues like climate change, people who express issues around sort of integration of different ethnicities or races. The proportion of people who, on the converse, express what are called materialist concerns, enough money, enough houses, has declined across the Western world. And there's been a theory that essentially says that as societies get richer, and as those basics are more assumed, people in some senses have the luxury of starting to think about these post-materialist concerns. In other words, when you are living in a country where you don't have a reliable income or bank account, political instability is very, very high, your infrastructure is very poor, your public services and social services and welfare policy is almost non-existent, you don't really care that China's building a coal power station every day. Your concerns are much more practical and fundamental. On the other hand, if you have the luxury to live in Westminster, you probably do really, really care about that, because you just assume that when you go to a bank and push your ATM card in, you're going to be able to get your salary. You assume that the public services you want, be it a GP or a school or social services, are all available for you at the touch of a button. Of course we can have a discussion about the relative accessibility and relative quality of them, and indeed that's the political debate we have in the UK all the time. But my point is that as countries become materially wealthier, citizens have the luxury of being able to debate other concerns. And indeed, if you plot, I haven't got this on the slide, if you plot the kind of GDP per capita against the proportion of citizens reporting concern, you see a very, very strong correlation in the last 40 years. As people get richer, they start to worry more about these types of things. But let's take this a little more broadly and bring it a bit of international. And indeed, CFE have done some really, really good work on this. Indeed, their recent literature review on kind of developing world education is really, really important. And often this doesn't get thought of, particularly in the UK education policy context. Because when I found myself in previous roles in the Barclay Foundation, talking to a lot of developing world governments, almost universally, as both Leslie and Gabriel have said, the discussion is about we want our children to be prepared, to be happy, to be prepared for a future world in which they're going to need new skills, to work in jobs that don't exist yet, and collaborate with people uncertain. And the only other thing that was missing from the previous two contributions, which normally gets chucked in, is something about AI and automation. And this may or may not be true. I have a personal scepticism of it. I am personally prepared to make that trade-off. But let's look at some facts, even if we're not interested in the trade-off. The name of the dog is Puppy. Very, very simple sentence. 3/4 of third grade students in a number of sub-Saharan African countries, age 7, cannot read that sentence. The name of the dog is Puppy. None of them will point out that why is the name of the dog the actual breed of the joint dog, but they can't read that simple sentence. 47 minus 60. In rural India, 3/4 of third grade students cannot do that subtraction sum in their head. Half of all 5th grade students can't do that sum in their head. In Brazil, looking at 15-year-olds, a country where there's been a huge investment in the system, it will take 75 years on current rate of progress for the maths rate of Brazilian 15-year-olds to hit the rich nation's OECD average. It will take 263 years for their reading average to hit the age of 15-year-olds. Now, AI and automation and the fourth industrial revolution may or may not hit. But I can tell you one thing, and I'm prepared to accept this as a judgment call, but it's prepared to be a judgment call I'm happy to make. If you cannot read that sentence, and if you cannot do a 2-degree subtraction, you sure as hell ain't going to be happy. Because you are not going to be the person controlling the robot, you are going to be the person being controlled by the robot. So there may or may not be a trade-off in this particular instance. But surely, we have to acknowledge as policymakers that where trade-offs do exist, that the biggest issue facing hundreds of millions of children across the world at the moment is that they cannot read, they cannot write, they cannot add up. And so if there is any form of trade-off between happiness and basic literacy and numeracy, I am personally happy to place my metaphorical bet as a taxpayer on sorting out the literacy and numeracy. If we can do that whilst making them happy, great. But ultimately, if we as policymakers don't sort out that issue, if we don't give children around the world the luxury of being able to also express post-materialist concerns, if we don't give them the luxury of wanting to be happy, we are never going to be in a situation where they improve. So the reason, as I say, I like this report is because it does point out very uncomfortable issues about trade-offs. It does tell us that we need to think about what our goals are, and as I say, my personal bet is that we need to focus on one side of that aisle more than the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Laura, could we get the microphone moving now? In fact, actually, could you bring me the microphone to start with, or one of them, got them both? And could you refresh would you mind refreshing the water glasses? I'll start us off. Okay, right, so let's, I think what we're going to do is we will keep back a little bit of time at the end for final remarks from the panelists and to give Gabriel a chance to answer some of those points made about the report. But let's crack on with questions and discussion at this point. And Lara, if you wait for the microphone, Lara will is Lara there? We'll come to you. Thanks. And if you could introduce yourself and your organisational role or whatever as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Alka Sable-Cuthbert. I'm a teacher and writer and researcher on education. I think it's interesting that, was it post-material concerns? I just think of that as like ethical or moral concerns. And I think actually all people have them, whatever their material circumstances. But I think what's different are the kind of public virtues that are valid at any time. And I don't think that it's just a case that because in countries like Britain we've got richer, you can just say that we now can be concerned about these kind of public concerns. I think you have to be more specific and look at what concerns are and how they've changed, and they have changed very much. The concern with well-being that's been described in the subject of this report, I think is, as a teacher, the idea of suffering does not seem great. It's not going to motivate me to go and teach. But, at another level, a level of kind of social discourse, political discourse, well-being, to me, is extremely harmful because it's actually actively anti-educational. You can see that happening right in our campuses today at the high level. Right today, there is a group of people asking to no platform somebody on the basis that hearing somebody speak is going to harm their well-being. Now, that kind of fundamental right of free speech is not just like a cherry on the top. It's actually how knowledge gets produced, critiqued, developed. So, in that sense, I think it is vitally important to challenge some of the claims for that. As to the second order thing of whether or not it improves education, I would agree with you. Teachers use a mixed bag repertoire of strategies, but there's kind of two discussions going on here, and I think it might be helpful to separate them out a bit. There's a strictly educational one, and then there's the wider political, ethical one that I think has been less discussed.
Okay, thank you for that. Other comments? Questions? Yes, Neil? Your question?
Neil McIntosh, I'm president of CFE, as you know, James. Published by Fluent. I was selecting a head teacher from a school locally the week before last, and we were talking about the previous head's successful period of control of the school, where he had, it was an 11 to 16 school, where he had a slogan of learning first. And there was a discussion about this for the first time for ages. And there were three groups of people. There were people who thought learning first was a good slogan, should be continued, people who didn't, and people who thought it was bizarre that there was any such discussion, because of course it was learning first, and why would anyone question it? People do question it. They question it for the reasons that Jonathan was alluding to and the last speaker.
Thank you.
There's an extraordinary number of almost every week there are things that people insist should be on the curriculum, whether it's obesity or something more social and less individual than obesity. There is a continual pressure on the curriculum, and the phrase a broad and balanced curriculum is now a Weaselish phrase, which needs thinking about, as well as the purpose of education. The purpose of school education for me is getting our students, almost all of them, to a basic level of competence in the main disciplines, as articulately put by Jonathan there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Neil. Susanna.
Hi, my name is Susanna Hares. I'm from the Centre for Global Development, a think tank based in Washington that works on development policy. So my comments are kind of quite developing country orientated, which Jonathan referred to a little bit in his comments. I think there's one of the few things we have a lot of evidence on in developing country education, to put it kind of simply, is the benefits of bad schools. So we know that keeping kids in school for longer, even if they're learning very little, has huge impact on, for example, reducing gender-based violence at home, reducing teenage pregnancy rates, reducing early marriage rates. And so I think when we are looking at sort of some of those countries, perhaps the definition of well-being, or the trade-off between achievement and well-being, perhaps needs to be thought about in a slightly different way. So Jonathan was fairly clear that he would prefer that kids are learning to read more, but I just wondered whether there would be a different perspective given some of those quite different trade-offs that we have in poorer countries.
Thank you. Okay, one more. Toby?
One thing that struck me listening to Gabriel and Leslie is that we do sacralise children's well-being, and a lot of the opposition to neo-trad trends in public education seem to be predicated on this idea that there is a trade-off, and that actually we should prioritise well-being. And there have been various campaigns, particularly against SATs in primary schools, led by parents. I can't remember what the phrase is.
Let kids be kids.
Let kids be kids. That is essentially sacralising children's well-being. What's actually slightly odd and remarkable is that on the one hand, almost exactly the same group of people who do sacralise children's well-being pathologise individual sources of children's happiness. So smartphones, video games, sugar. And how do you reconcile those two things? How can you on the one hand think that nothing's more important than a happy child and regard that as an absolute priority, but on the other hand, think that any individual causes of that child's happiness are completely pathological?
Thank you. Okay, panel responses. Who'd like to go first? Anybody want to respond? It's just try and respond to one of those. Jonathan.
So let me take Susanna's point, who, as I said, won't very politely correct me, whilst making it sound like a question. So yes, look, I do accept, of course, that schools are delivering a range of wider benefits, as well as literacy and numeracy, and that in the developing world, particularly, they are the universal public service where, to the extent that social policy is executed in those countries, often does happen through the schools. So yes, I agree, and I think to the extent that there's a trade-off, it's never an absolute trade-off. It is, of course, possible to have elements of both, and the Barclay Foundation does a lot of non-learning-based elements through schools in the developing world, and it's pretty effective. I guess the main point I'm trying to make, though, is that I think a lot of those governments and policymakers are tilting the balance too far towards that they are relatively comfortable with schools where the learning profile is so flat that children could be in school until they were about 95, before statistically they were able to kind of read that one sentence or answer that two-digit subtraction. And so whilst, of course, it's nice to have an element of both, I would personally kind of like a government to talk a little bit more about that and a little less about the other things that they are getting.
No, not that I can respond to the question. So I wanted to respond to the final question about happiness. Actually, it's interesting. If you have children at home that are in school, go home and ask your child whether they're happy at school on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 to 7 being very happy, which is exactly what the PISA uses. And then ask them what makes them happy at school. And I have a 10-year-old, I did ask him that question, and he told me, oh yeah, I like it when we're able to go play with the nursery children. I like that we went on this fun field trip. So you're right, when you're measuring something like moment-to-moment happiness, sure, it's the things like that that are going to make children happy. It's not whether the teacher is using memorization versus groups for learning. Those are the things that influence their moment-to-moment happiness. So I agree with you. The point is that we need to think about well-being and then decide on what kind of conception we have of well-being. What's important? What outcomes are matter? What do we care about? What do we need children to have as well-being? And that's really what needs to be agreed upon. And it is resilience. It is, yes, feeling failure and then saying, okay, I'm going to try again. And that's the issue, is that in this report, well-being is measured by moment-to-moment happiness. And my point is that it's not well-being.
I do want to give Gabriel a chance to speak to this, if you would. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, no, it's not. I mean, the report, first of all, focusing too much on a PISA graph is probably not what you should do when we criticize this report, is whether or not the research that I cite is relevant or not. The PISA report, sure, the correlation there that I showed might not be causal. The question is the research that I cite causal? And yes, it is. The EEF reviews a lot of different studies in their kind of reviews. It makes good with bad research. So I wouldn't draw too many conclusions from those reviews. Essentially, first of all, yes, it's true. I mean, I look at subjective well-being. This is a question that asking people how they feel in life and happiness and so on, that's become a really important part of public policy. Life satisfaction has become an important goal for public policy, even so that Bhutan, I think, highlighted it should be gross national happiness. So it is relevant, but it's not only the PISA question. I think the PISA question is one question. All the other ones use TIMS, and they look much more, even if you may not like the index of pupil-led learning in PISA, there's plenty of other studies looking at other types of more when they ask about memorization. We spend much more time listening to lectures and taking notes and so forth, which you may like better. It's the same results. So focusing too much on two graphs there, that's just to highlight the relationship in a policy report. The research is much wider than that. And I don't really care what the OECD says about what we need in the future. Okay, we've heard that. There's always been the case that the future of jobs is uncertain. We don't know exactly what skills we will need in 15, 20 years' time. We didn't know that 50 years ago either. That doesn't decrease the importance of knowledge. And I can highlight the fact that yes, it is true that memorization is still necessary, will still be necessary in the future. Without memorization drill, this kind of things that we find boring, we cannot transfer knowledge from our working memory to our long-term memory. It becomes impossible to learn anything. So in order to solve problems, we need that knowledge from the beginning. So I would say that I take the point that obviously well-being is more than just subjective well-being. And the point you made there, that there's evidence that certain interventions improve or decrease criminality and improves other outcomes, teenage pregnancies, those are obviously other measures of well-being that we should consider. And the evidence is much more positive that there is no trade-off. So some schools in randomized studies in America, you find that schools that improve academic achievement also often have positive effects on or decreasing crime rates, for example, among youth kids. It's not always the case. There may be, in some cases, you find interventions that only affect long-term outcomes without affecting academic achievement. My point in this paper was to focus on one specific trade-off, which I see has become very important in public policy, subjective well-being. There are other trade-offs and things we can discuss about that.
Thank you. Okay, back to the floor. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Tanya Clark. I'm an education researcher from Cambridge Assessment. I just wanted to pick up on that discussion there about measuring subjective well-being. In the OECD measures of well-being, there is one thing that we need to bear in mind, which is the fact that that measure needs to be suitable for a whole range of different jurisdictions and nationalities. There is a huge body of literature that is looking at assessments of well-being internationally and the types of things we need to bear in mind when we're using instruments cross-nationally. And the reason for that is obviously because well-being means different things in different contexts. I think somebody picked up on that earlier in terms of developing and non-developing countries. But something that I wanted to point out in terms of the UK context, which perhaps is something food for thought for future research, What we see in the UK, in terms of subjective well-being, there are different types of subjective well-being. And one of them is interpersonal well-being and interpersonal connectedness. What we see in the UK is a huge decline in interpersonal connectedness. And this has been found in the Good Child report from 2010 to 2016, huge declines, and also in the more recent measurement of loneliness in the UK. The young population, aged 16 in the UK, they are the loneliest population. And so what I'm really getting to here is interpersonal well-being something that we need to think about? And actually, I think that might extend beyond pedagogy and extends beyond the teacher. It's actually about the school systems, the ecological systems that children grow up in, and the value that we place on interpersonal connectedness. I've also found this in my own research, which showed that there's a link between individual playfulness, opportunities to be playful, and interpersonal well-being, which is linked to life satisfaction well-being. It's mediated by interpersonal well-being. So I just wondered if that was an area for consideration, that specific kind of well-being, as this interpersonal well-being seems to be quite a concern here.
Thank you very much. Yes, in the back.
Richard Davis. I'm based at University of Central Lancashire in Preston. I think if there needs to be a trade-off, I'm not against trade-offs educationally. I think if there has to be a trade-off, then we need to be clear that actually it needs to be a trade-off. That it's not just a particular notion of achievement and a particular notion of well-being that are being traded off. So I want to try and give a couple of examples from my own work, particularly looking at the STEM and the use of the arts in relation to girls' achievement. So one of the things we know is that girls are achieving as well as boys in STEM subjects, but at every opportunity stop in STEM over preference to doing something else. That is that their achievement is high, but their conception of their own subjective well-being in relation to STEM seems to be low. And one of the reasons why we work on STEM and the arts is to be able to look at that subjective well-being in relation to STEM. The implication for girls is that they tend to achieve less well in STEM over their entire life in school, and that also they see a decrease in their STEM knowledge into adulthood. That has all kinds of knock-on effects. It seems to me though that the achievement well-being trade-off is not possible in a general policy perspective, that we need to think in terms of the ways in which achievement and well-being interact in particular kind of career choices, and that actually making STEM subjects more well-being focused, both in subjective and other terms, may actually improve achievement. And so we can knock, I think, fairly easy ways in progressive education of knocking subjective well-being and happiness. And I agree with you that happiness, I work particularly on Aristotle, so my notions of happiness are I'm not very happy about happiness. I think it's easy to knock some of those, but it seems to me that a more sophisticated notion of achievement, what are we going to achieve and what we conceive of the ways in which subjective well-being interact with individual life decisions for people, seems to be a much more complex way in which trade-off isn't really the key way as a one-for-all policy. It seems to be there are trade-offs in a number of different ways in relation to particular people's particular career and educational journeys.
Thank you. Professor Smithers.
I haven't been able to hear the microphone very well. Can everybody hear me? Or would you like to use this? Which do you prefer? I've got just two questions. One is, first of all, has the paper been published? Is it up on the website? Because I enjoyed it very much. I'd like to study it in detail. The other is, I've got a confession, which is I don't really understand what well-being is. It's used in a great variety of ways, and I can't. It's difficult for me to admit this from the University of Buckingham, of course, but we're the first positive university in the country and whatever. I think to pin it down, are there any measures of well-being that aren't self-report? Is there an operational definition of well-being that you can relate to achievement in exams or what have you? Can we pin it down more precisely?
Okay, let's get some panel responses. Leslie, do you want to respond to that specific question first?
Well, there's a lot of different measures of well-being. I guess it's depending on how you're thinking about it. Are you thinking about mental health well-being? You're thinking more psychological well-being, and you're thinking more about mental health and how people are feeling about themselves. And then you have, material well-being and social well-being, which is relating to other people. So again, I think there's just this umbrella that we use, that everything that's positive is called well-being, and what we really need to do is think about what really are we talking about here? What do we care about? What are the outcomes? And that's my point, is just instead of using well-being, just say happiness. And that just makes it clear what we're talking about here. And I think that's really what's important, is that we all have different visions in our head of what well-being is. And should loneliness go under the umbrella of well-being? Maybe it shouldn't. We just call it loneliness. We're interested in loneliness. And I think that's really what's important here, is in using these terms that have some sort of, interest, that catchphrases without really understanding what they mean is really problematic, and it stops understanding what we're talking about.
Okay, Gabriel, can you speak to that point as well?
Yeah, you could do well-being in other ways, the psychological evaluations that they do in Swedish draft, for example. They have to go to those psychological evaluations of various things. There are many different metrics of well-being. Achievement, subjective well-being could also have been the title of the paper, or achievement, happiness, trade-off could also have been the title of the paper. In the paper criteria, I'm talking about subjective well-being. And it's not only happiness, it's also about, do you enjoy learning? Stuff like that. So it's the process of learning, if they enjoy it. Joyous. That's the kind of stuff, that's what I'm talking about. There are other metrics as well you can look at. But I'm not aware of many studies, or any studies that do analyze that kind of stuff when it comes to this particular trade-off. So in the paper, I think it's quite clear that it's subjective well-being we're talking about. And the reason why it's important is because, again, it has become an important part of public policy.
Thank you.
So, this is the reason why this issue is so fascinating, and Gabriel's right that it is a really important part of public policy. And what politicians in education for the last easily 5 years, probably slightly more, well, certainly a lot since the EEF was created, but even before that, there's been this kind of trend towards evidence-based policy, right? What does the evidence tell us? And we'll only spend the marginal pound where the evidence tells us it's the best way. And that is very much the appropriate thing to say. And if you say that, everyone nods wisely and kind of hopes for the next research grant out of the DfE. I'm actually pretty sceptical of that as a governing leitmotif for public policy, which is not to say that it plays no role whatsoever, but actually this is a really, really good example of an area that is partly very, very richly evidence-informed, and partly, as per the point we've just been having, not so much. So if we take the very specific issue of mental health at the moment, almost anyone who works in education in the UK would tell you that there has been a rise in mental health amongst young people. And there is some outcome-based statistics to show that. So, for example, the number of young people being referred to mental health services has increased significantly. But actually, almost all the evidence, strictly speaking, evidence is self-reported. The last data set on which this has really been clinically measured is like 10, 15 years old. Now, my point is not that there is no mental health crisis. My point is not that there is a mental health crisis. It is that, strictly speaking, we don't actually know, but almost everyone in education will tell you there is one. What do you do about that if you are a head teacher? What do you do about that if you're in a local authority? What do you do about that if you're in NHS or in CAMS or if you are the Secretary of State for Education? You could commission further evidence, but some of this is methodologically hard to get under the skin of. You could say, well, there is no data to show this, and therefore we are continuing to make public policy choices again. Or you could, and I'm saying this deliberately crudely, on not much evidence, decide to significantly increase the focus you place on those as policymakers. Now, all of those are viable choices, but they are all choices. And I guess my plea is, in this area, as in all areas, this comes back to the point I made about trade-offs. If you are going to make greater investments in issues of well-being because you think it's important in public policy, do so recognising that in some senses that is a small p and big P political choice you're making. That's fine, but stand up and be prepared to be counted on it. If you want to invest more in mental health, as this government is doing, do so, but don't pretend that it's a really cut and dried issue, and neither should you be prepared to do not another issue. So Tanya's point, I think, was really interesting about the kind of level of loneliness, issues of kind of interpersonal connectedness. Alan is right that there's not much data out there that's not self-reported. Richard's point around, could we make trade-offs within the kind of STEM curriculum? Absolutely we could, but these are judgments and they're choices and they're really, really difficult to make.
And it may also be that mental health crisis is interesting. So it may have nothing to do with school, of course. So what we've seen in Sweden, for example, it's a survey going back to 85, the HBSC survey, Health and Behavioral School something. And what we see is that, yes, there are problems, increasing in Scandinavia as well. Mental health problems are increasing. At the same time, the school enjoyment is going up. So kids saying, I like school more, how is that related? Is that the reason? Is the reason that we're not making education, is it that we stress them too much? Well, not really. Apparently, the same thing. Are you stressed about your schoolwork? That's gone down as well among boys. Because school is not as tough as it was in 85. Everybody knows that. But instead we presume that, we need to ignore exams and we should make it less hard for kids to attend school. Whereas it might not have anything to do with school. Whereas there's a lot of people presuming that these things are interrelated.
What about this, was it Paul?
Richard.
Sorry?
Richard,
I'm sorry. So what about this point Richard makes in relation to the potential of taking a trade-offs approach to a wide range of issues, such as you mentioned the example of girls' achievement in STEM, their long-term choices. Anybody want to say anything to that?
So, I think, and correct me if I've misinterpreted, I think the point you're making, Richard, was that the current curricula in STEM allows girls to achieve as well as boys based on whatever metric we're using, but their self-reported sense of achievement and well-being is less, so therefore they kind of opt out. They don't do triple science, they don't do STEM A-levels and so on. And it ought to be possible at the curricular level to make some sort of trade-off that increases girls' enjoyment of the subject. Look, I'm not an expert enough in the STEM curricula to know whether that is true or not, but I think it's certainly plausible in theory. But my hypothesis is that at some point relatively soon you would get to a point where you would hit that trade-off. So there is always this question between. It kind of depends why girls' self-reported sense of self is less. It might be that they find the curriculum too inaccessible. It might be that they find it too... I don't know, I'm purely speculating. But my point is that, yes, it is very, very possible to acknowledge a wider set of trade-offs, and whether that's in the curriculum you teach or the manner in which you teach, the extent to which you could do boys' classes, girls' classes, the extent to which you do after-school classes, the extent to which you change subject choices, so you do or do not offer triple science versus double science, the extent to which you timetable STEM A-levels, the extent to which you require subject grade at GCSEs as entry to STEM. Yes, of course, all of those are variables that you can play around with, but I guess my point is you don't entirely escape the issue that at some point you may have to face a trade-off. And if we decide at a school level or at a public policy level, look, almost everybody needs an element of STEM. If we're losing half the population at STEM A-levels, we need to change something for that for various other reasons. That's a perfectly legitimate choice.
Can you say my point's a bit further, which is actually that by ignoring to some extent or trading off achievement against well-being, what we do is the overall achievement of girls is lower than it is for boys, because by actually focusing on achievement as opposed to well-being, it means that actually the overall achievement of girls is less. So when we start, in terms of the report, it's problematising the notion of achievement, that achievement as a single unit is problematic here because some people achieve and some people don't because of the way in which this trade-off might be articulated in particular policy. And at the moment in the STEM subject, it's articulated in a way that means that boys tend to achieve overall more than girls. And that, I think, in the relation to the report is around this subjective well-being relationship to seeing yourself as a STEM career as a girl as opposed to a boy. And so achievement, I'm trying to make achievement more problematic, I think.
Yeah.
One of the things is that it's not individual happiness that we're talking about. It seems to me. The school I was referring to earlier always refers to itself as a happy school. And what it means by that is that young people are extraordinarily courteous. I mean, not sort of bootlickingly so, but they are courteous in a way that they're not in all schools, perhaps in most schools. And that is a real plus for that establishment. And the manifestation of it, of that courtesy, which is, well, the way it's confirmed in a sense is that governors, every now and again when there are 4 new governors or something like that, a number of new governors over the last 6 months, they have a day of being introduced thoroughly to the school. And that includes a meeting with a panel from the students' organisation, representative organisation, and we sit down with these young people who invariably say that one of their problems is low-level disruption in the classroom, which the teachers deny is a problem. But their happiness, therefore, comes from well-ordered classrooms where they've got a good and positive learning environment. And I suspect that would be true for most young people.
It gets back to this notion that people understand happiness differently.
But actually, that is also actually a very good example of where you can genuinely get a win-win. So low-level disruption, which is incredibly prevalent in UK classrooms, has been shown to have a significant detrimental impact on pupil attainment. Now, well-behaved classrooms are actually more efficient than badly behaved classrooms. So if it were possible, and if wishing made it so, but if it were possible to eliminate or significantly reduce low-level disruption in class, you would absolutely see both an increase in self-reported well-being and attainment. So that is a good example of where there's a
kids might be fun with the disruption.
It causes the disruption.
Oh, yeah. They're
not sure on the receiving.
No.
Okay, we've got one in the back here. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Marcel Starikov. I've just finished being a primary head teacher and been in education for the last 20 years. I've now set up consultancy company called JUNK, Thinking and Learning. JUNK stands for the joy of not knowing. And I can't believe how today's conversation runs so closely to everything that I've been trying to develop in practice and over the last 20 years. I think it's really fascinating the whole issue around happiness, and I completely agree with practically everything you've said, Leslie, today. When you ask a child if they're happy at school, they do immediately relay that happiness to being able to have lots of playtime and being free to do what they want to do, and all sorts of things that we don't normally equate to attainment and teaching and learning. That's one form of happiness that they immediately relate to: free time, watching, all those sorts of things. The other bit of happiness that they normally feel is when they know the answer to a question. If they feel they know the answer to a question, then they tend to naturally feel happy. But what I have been trying to develop is happiness around the issue of learning and not knowing. And it's really, really interesting when you start from very, very young age to develop the cognitive ability of very young children to realize that if they know the answer to a question, they're not learning anything new. And in order to learn anything new, they have to not know it first. So in order to then be happy in the learning process, as you were saying, Gabriel, for that joy to happen, it's vital, I think, from a very, very early age for children to realise that in order to learn something new, they have to not know it first. And then creating a school infrastructure where children feel completely safe to then have a go at the learning, knowing that that they're equipped with all the lifelong learning dispositions, all the intellectual playfulness, and all the factors that enable them to then go through the actual learning process. And what I have found with this approach is that children then become intrinsically motivated to want to learn. And I would argue that that is when you actually reach happiness, when children are actually intrinsically motivated to want to learn, then that leads to what I think we're talking about in terms of their happiness. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more question here from the front, and then I'm going to ask panellists to make their concluding brief remarks. Thank you.
Hello there, Panelist from the Wellcome Trust. I had the privilege in my previous job of spending a bit of time in China, actually talking to people around policy in China, and going to some of the schools. China is clearly very high well, Shanghai, I suppose, is high in the PISA ranking. But it was an eye-opener, looking at the level of well-being of the students in relation to their attainment, in that they actually left school at 3 o'clock and then moved on to a shadow curriculum where they were taught most of the same things again. So I think what I would say is, in summing up, there is a trade-off between these two things, and I think maybe we don't actually have the conversation, and they certainly haven't had it in China. I'm talking to the officials there, they're desperate to actually change the system. They're trying to work out what to change it to, and I'm not sure they really know themselves. But clearly their students are not happy, and yet they are deeply worried that those students are not job ready for the kind of jobs that are actually going to be available. I wouldn't say any more than that, because I'm not sure they know what to do. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay, so concluding remarks from the panellists. If I can ask you 1 minute each to deliver key messages from what you've been saying this morning. We start with Jonathan, actually, and then go to Leslie, and then Gabriel.
So I guess to just recap briefly, my contention is that there are trade-offs throughout education policy. We should be much more explicit about the acknowledgement of them. We should be much more explicit about what ultimate goal we are trying to reach, without descending into kind of motherhood and apple pie-ness, which is very, very difficult. We should resist the temptation to think that there's a single path to these things, that evidence can give us the answer. We should be much more comfortable as policymakers and politicians with a myriad of factors. We should talk much more about the importance of things like how expensive it is to do something, how easy it is to execute something, what we have the capacity within our system to do. We should acknowledge that a lot of this stuff is really, really complicated, and to the extent that, whether we call it happiness or whether we call it well-being, to the extent that those things are important in public policy, we should accept that those are important, and we will try to get to them in a messy, fudged, often counterproductive, often complex way, because that is the way that public policy is made, and if it weren't that, then we wouldn't have the benefit of being at events like this.
I just want to think about that we need to be careful about what kind of words we use, how we're defining things, what we're thinking about well-being. Well-being is different than mental health. They are related, but they're only weakly correlated, actually, in the most recent Millennium Cohort sample, for example. So they're different things. And what you're talking about is the idea of being resilient, knowing that you can make mistakes and start again. These are all very important conceptions that influence the developing child and that influence them in terms of their achievement. And we need to think about these separately, and what kind of school environment can nourish those different abilities and those different skills, so that we can have children who both know how to achieve and do well, and also just to be functioning adults. You know, nobody that's happy, if you have anybody that's unhappy, you know you can't do anything, you know, you're not productive. So those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I think we just need to think a little bit more about, like you said, you know, what our goals are, what do we want to achieve, what do we want our schools to look like. And these are important questions that we all need to consider.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I think the last point there is on the point as well. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you go to countries such as, or China in this case, Shanghai, but also Finland, Korea, high-performing countries, they do report often that they do not like school. They do not enjoy school. They're not that happy. They don't like their teachers, but they perform very, very well. It's kind of, the interesting thing is that China is also banning homework, because it's been so demanded. They're trying to go in the same direction as most Western countries. And this is something that's been going on for a long period of time. You mentioned emancipative values, or the self-expression values, post-materialist values. I do believe very strongly that these methods, the child-centered methods, what do they relate to? Those kind of values. We care more about children's kind of freedom and individuality. And there is a striking correlation as well between the level of pupil-led learning and these types of values once you adjust for other things as well. So the final point is, again, I think I've heard a lot of points, and they're often very valid. I do feel still that it's very difficult to get this point across about trade-offs, that we really need to think about this. It's not only about well-being. There are other things in education that there may be trade-offs between. And we just have to consider the evidence in each area, and then, as Jonathan has been highlighting, discuss precisely what goals we want to advance in public policy.
Well, thank you very much to Gabriel for providing the report that we're all eagerly looking forward to reading tomorrow and outlining it for us today, and also to our guest panelists, Dr. Leslie Gutman, and also Jonathan Simons, and again our thanks to Cambridge Assessment. To you all, I bid you good day. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Bye-bye.